Hello everyone, welcome to the PowerPlay Chess channel. Danny still on a break, so I am having the privilege to cover the second round of the Sinquefield Cup. A lot of great games this time, and there were two victories. Hans Niemann, the wildcard in the event, managed to defeat Shahriar Mamliarov in a nice style, while Jan Nepomniachtchi bounced back with a fantastic technical performance, defeating Alireza Firouzja. Two very interesting games, but still, I've decided to pick another game for this analysis. It's the game between Fabiano Caruana and his second friend, neighbor. They both live in St. Louis next to each other, Leinier Dominguez. And it's always interesting to see when people who are working with each other, they are facing each other in a game. And we have a very special opening. It's the Petrov. That in itself it's not too special, but it's a very important line. So let's go to the moves. We have the main line of the Petrov, and now the variation with fifth move, knight c3, and after knight takes c3, d takes c3, bishop e7, bishop e3. This is all very well-known theory, and white is opting for setup with opposite castled kings. Really sharp line. And after knight f6, bishop d3, we have a well-known position which has been tested numerous times in that famous World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. And in that match, Dominguez was one of the seconds of Caruana. And remember, this was this famous opening preparation which was leaked by a mistake. And it was exactly this line. And Fabi in that game opted for the plan with c5, which has the idea to take away the d4 square from any of white's pieces, but also preparing to get a queen out. Well, we get to see something very similar in the current game between Fabi and Dominguez, as after bishop d3, black instead played rook e8. And now the main move is rook h to e1, but since white is planning to go for an attack, it makes sense just to go for it straight away with the move h3, so that after c5, the g-pawn is brought up the board and is ready to kick the knight from f6 any time soon. But first, black is going to hit the pawn on a2, white goes a3, and here black played d5. So the idea is that you can always try to jump with your knight to e4 in case the knight gets under threat. And now Fabi played c4, and this has never been seen before. And I guess it's all still home preparation. And in fact, the prep by Fabi goes really deep in this game. It should be clear that after queen takes d2, bishop takes d2, I believe white is just a bit better. And that's because of the pawn on c5. Very soon we will probably activate the bishop in case you're taking on c4. In this symmetrical position, white is just a bit more active. And, well, black could consider playing d4, but after rook e1, bishop e6, c3. In these sort of positions, white is just slightly more active, and that's what really counts in symmetrical positions. So Dominguez started to think here, played queen a4. This is the first move by the computer, putting pressure against the pawn on c4, and Fabi reacted instantly with the move c3. And after d takes c4, you're threatening the bishop. White's idea was to drop back with the bishop to c2. The fact that black has won a pawn doesn't really matter at all. Bishop is safe and stable, and black has to be precise, because if you're careless, let's say you play queen c6, we go knight e5, and we are building up fantastic play with our pieces, setting up threats against the black queen with a discovered attack by the knight, for instance. So Dominguez dropped back with the queen to a6 instead. So the queen is still helping out along the 6th rank. White played g5, kicking the knight away, and black is for a big choice here. If he goes knight d7, we'll probably go rook h to e1, and well, you're stuck. What are you going to do with your pieces on the queen side? So he decided to play here knight h5, but then the knight is, at least for the moment, it's stuck at the side of the board. White played knight e5, jumping into the action, and now bishop e6, by far the most natural move. And white followed it up with f4, strengthening the knight on e5, and also thinking about ideas based on bringing the queen over via the second rank, maybe to f2 and then to h4, attacking the pawn on c5 at the same time. In any case, black played here the move knight g3, threatening the rook on h1. So the rook went to e1, and now the knight find a stable post on f5. And it could very well be that Dominguez had all seen this before, but he had to recall everything. He was spending a lot of time, and Fabi was also spending a bit of time, but probably he was still pretty much in book. And after the next move, bishop takes c5, we have action on the board, because after bishop takes c5, we get to see a piece sacrifice. It's a forcing sequence, bishop f5, bishop takes f5, and now queen to d5 with a double attack against the bishop as well as the pawn on f7. So you have to be very careful. Like if you would ignore both threats, let's say you take on h3, there is queen takes f7, and that is a big move, as after king h8 you can just drop back with the queen to d5, and we are threatening the bishop. But if you move the bishop away, then we of course have this beautiful idea with knight f7, king g8, knight h6, double check. King has to go back into the corner, and now queen g8, rook takes g8, knight f7. The famous smothered mate motive is on the board. So that's of course something very easy for those guys. They have no problem spotting it. But Dominguez had to spend quite a bit of time here. He can, for instance, put a bishop on e6 or place the queen on e6. But I think in both cases, black is still struggling. That knight on e5 is very unpleasant to deal with. White would take on c5, think about ideas with rook d6. The fact that the pawn on h3 is hanging doesn't really matter that much. White will definitely be able to put pressure via the open files in the center. So black played the critical move, bishop f2, counter-attacking the rook on e1. And now queen takes f7 check, king h8, and white decides to take the bishop on f5. Bishop takes e1, rook takes e1, and I wouldn't be surprised. This is where the home prep ended for at least for Fabi. What's the situation on the board? White is an exchange down, has one pawn for it, but this knight on e5 is a monster. There are so many tactical possibilities, and you got to watch out for discover checks, knight forks, pawn breaks coming up very soon. Dominguez played a very natural move. He played rook f8. He wanted to kick the queen away from f5, but this is a serious mistake, which Fabi failed to take advantage of, because he should have played here the move queen to d7. And this is a very, very big move, because the queen is active. It takes away many squares from the black queen, first of all, so the queen cannot be centralized. But if you would play rook d8, attacking the queen, there's of course knight f7, forking the king and rook. And if you take on f7, there's queen takes d8 with a back rank mate. The other critical possibility here is rook takes f4, but in that case we will also play knight f7. If you go king g8, there's rook e8, take on e8, and it's once again checkmate on the back rank. So the only move after knight f7 is rook takes f7, queen takes f7, queen g6. And that's the way to stop the mating threat with rook e8, as the queen covers that square indirectly. But after queen g6, hg6, rook e7, this rook endgame is really bad. Pawns are really vulnerable, will be attacked by the white rook, but most importantly, this king will never become an active piece. So this looks all pretty bad. Why did Fabi didn't play the move queen d7? That's the big question. And I believe that he was looking at this idea with queen b6, so that the queen is looking for ways to counterattack via f2, hitting the rook on e1, as well as threatening to take on f4. But the point is that we have knight f7, king g8, and now rook e7. Very important line with the main idea of playing here the move knight h6, and after that both the queen and rook, they can just take the pawns, and that will lead to checkmate. So, for instance, if you play queen g1, there's king c2, queen g2, king to b1. You can draw back with the queen, but there's knight h6. And if you would take the knight, there's this idea which I just explained. Of course, the knight doesn't have to be taken. It can be ignored by king h8, but then queen d4 is a beautiful drop back of the queen, threatening mate on g7. You got to go queen g6, check. The king goes away, so here we see the king is absolutely safe at the side of the board. No more checks. You may consider rook a e8. Looks as if black has everything under control, but now fantastic deflection motive with the move f5, and black is no longer able to keep everything defended, because if the queen would move to h5, let's say, then it will be mate on g7. That square needs to be protected. If you take on g5, then we can simply take on e8, and after taking back, we have knight f7 with a knight fork picking up the queen. So then only rook takes e7 is possible, but after f takes g6, white has a queen and knight versus two rooks. That is game over. So very, very huge moment, and surprisingly was not spotted by Caruana. He instead played here the move queen to e4. And by the way, what I shouldn't forget to mention is that idea with queen d7 followed by a knight check and getting the rook into the 7th rank is incredibly dangerous. And instead of rook to f8, black should have gone rook a8. This is the most stubborn defense that stops the threat of queen d7. Obviously, knight f7 is one possibility, but after king g8, knight takes d8, rook takes e1, king d2, rook e7. Still quite a tricky position. There are still some play, but definitely black is not having too many problems. Instead of knight f7, there are different ways of playing, like h4 is a slow way of trying to improve the attack. But generally speaking, this is still interesting, but I believe black should be able to neutralize the initiative by white. So let's continue with the game. After rook f8, queen e4 on the board, and now black missed another very important possibility to centralize the queen with queen e6, getting the queen back into the center. g6 is the critical move, threatening knight f7 and winning the queen thanks to a discovered attack. But now queen f5 is a good move, so that after knight f7, check, the rook no longer defends the queen, but black has to give back the exchange, and then it's material even, but still I would take white. I believe white is a bit more active, but well, it's playable for black for sure. So queen e6, big move. Should be said that rook a e8 is not a great idea because of queen d5. And then knight f7 becomes a huge threat. If you go queen e6, you can take, and knight f7, and you regain the material, remaining a pawn up. And that's a technically winning rook endgame for white. Can bring up the king, and black's king is still pretty passive. So after queen e4, black played the move rook a8, but now the rook is no longer needed there, and white brings up the f-pawn. Very important idea, and we will see that the pawn can make a big impact in the next couple of moves. But let's see. Here, if you would play queen d6, looking for ways to generate counterplay, then g6 is another interesting idea. Threatening knight f7, and if you would play queen f6, I think knight f7 is one possibility. This is definitely okay for white. White is more active in the endgame with queen and rook, but probably even better is just to make sure that the king will be safe, and the pawn on f5 can never really be taken. That's important to realize, because after queen takes, rook takes, you have knight f7 forking the king and rook, but also after rook takes f7, g takes f7, that pawn cannot be stopped. Whatever happens, there will be rook e8, and the f-pawn is queening. So for that reason, black decided not to do anything. He thought that everything is well placed. Let's play b5, but that's a weakening move, in fact, because white has now the possibility to jump in with the knight to c6, attacking the rook. And what should black do? Well, if you go rook d e8, we're going to take on e8, and it's back rank mate, so that's not a great idea. If you would play rook d6, for instance, then we have queen to e7, so no chance to attack the knight. This is winning for white. And then rook d7 is an interesting try, but that runs into the brilliant knight to b8 with the idea we have seen already. You cannot remove the rook from f8 because there is queen e8 with check. Black is forced to take, and once again it's checkmate. That's why after knight b8, queen d6 is the only way to avoid further damage. But then you can take on d7. White is a pawn up, can activate the rook as well, because still the pawn cannot be taken because of the back rank mate. While if you go queen c8, for instance, we have just rook d5. White is just having a great position with an extra pawn. In the game there followed rook c8, attacking the knight, but now we see the knight comes to e7, attacking the rook once again. Rook c8 on the board, and now another big moment because Fabi misses another chance to go for victory. He could have gone here for the move f6. In the game he played queen h4, but we will see that's not gonna work out. It's a sensible idea, queen h4, with ideas of knight g6, and the queen protects the rook, but with the move f6 we are setting up even bigger threats. The point is that if you would take the pawn, we will play g6, and now that g-pawn is really strong. We're opening up the king side. In case you're gonna take, we take with the queen, and nothing can be done against queen h6 with checkmate. Then there are other possibilities, like for instance you could play queen d6, but there's g7, which is the key move, and after king takes g7 only move, there's knight f5, king h8, knight takes d6, rook takes e4, rook takes e4, and white remains a pawn up. So there's this big threat with g7, and also in the line with queen to b6 there is this idea to play g7. Don't get tempted by playing queen h4, by the way. That would allow rook takes e7, giving back the exchange. Looks like it's game over, but black is in time with the idea to go for queen g1, and if you stop the check we have queen g5 and force the exchange of queens. But as I said, g7 here again, it's the key move. King takes g7, knight f5, and where do you go with the king? There are not that many good squares. The most logical move seems to be king h8, but then again we have queen takes e8 with a beautiful mating motive with rook and knight. If you would play king to g8, we have queen g4, king h8 and checkmate. The same can be said about king to g6, queen g4 and checkmate on g7 as the rook covers the e-file, no chance to escape. While after king to f7, that's the most difficult line to see in advance. There is this move knight d6, giving a check, forking the king and rook. If you would take, there's queen takes h7 with checkmate. So beautiful clearance sacrifice, opening up the diagonal for the queen to take on h7. Then after f6, of course black doesn't have to take, but if you do that, let's say queen d6, we are going to take on g7 and play knight f5 anyway. Rook takes f5, queen takes e8. In such position, black is just lost. In positions with major pieces only, it's all about king safety. If you go queen f4, we will make sure the king is safe, enter with the rook, king h6, queen d7 for instance, threatening to take on h7, queen g6, just get a king to a2, and we are not in a rush, but black is really going to struggle, the pawns are weak, rook e6 is always a move to reckon with. If you go rook f1, we go queen d2, there's no chance to threaten mate because of that queen d2 check. If you go queen g5, we have rook takes h7, and it's game over. In case of king h5, there's queen e2, and so on. So let's see, in the game, after queen h4, black played here the move queen to d6, and black could have faced here knight g6, but after king g8, knight takes f8, rook takes e1, queen takes e1, queen f4 check, Queen d2, queen f1, queen d1, queen f4. Looks like it's going to be a repetition. But anyway, after picking up the pawn on f5 with check, you can take on f8. And probably this queen endgame should just end in a draw anyway. For that reason, rook e4 was Fabi's move, keeping everything defended. And that's of course a nice little trick, because if you would take on e7, then we will play g6 and threatening mate, threatening to take on e7. Of course, Dominguez is not going to fall for that. Played here the move rook d8, threatening mate himself. Of course, queen takes h4 doesn't work because of king takes, rook h4, and the queen can still interpose on h6, so you shouldn't do that. Knight g6 was the move on the board. King g8, you cannot take the knight because of the pin. And well, here you can go for a repetition of moves. Of course, black will not go king f7 because of queen h5. Take on h7, and it's going to be checkmate. While in case of the move played in the game, rook to d4, white is finally threatening to take on f8. Now the d file has been closed. There's no mating threat on d1. But after h takes g6, rook takes d6, rook takes d6, fg. White threatens mate, but the pawn will be taken. In this endgame, white no longer has serious winning chances. After a4, a6, queen g3, black finally will try to connect the rooks, and that's exactly what happened in the game. White is looking for counter chances with the g-pawn. Black is threatening to take the pawn, so queen b8 only move, rook f8, queen takes b5. And now obviously black is not interested in taking the pawn, because that will lead to an endgame with queen and two pawns versus two rooks. Very good winning chances for white. In the game, they followed rook f1, and after king d2, rook f2, and it's going to be a draw. King c1 is a huge blunder, because that would allow checkmate on e1. But if you go king d1, which was Fabi's choice, there is rook f1, king d2, and neither side is really advised to play on in this position. I thought this was the most fascinating game of the second round. The other two victories by white, by Hans Niemann and by Mamedyarov, Hans Niemann and Jan Nepomniachtchi. They were also great games, but I thought here was a lot of action on the board with a lot of theoretical relevance in the Petrov. So hope you enjoyed this one. I'll be hopefully back soon again, but first it's Danny's time to get back to the channel. See you soon. All the best. Bye bye.